One of the best parts about the Octarius box set was the awesome orc scenery that came with it. Like all Games Workshop terrain, it's sturdy and looks fantastic with loads of tiny little details. I was really impressed by how Jester painted our collection here. I think she nailed the rust look perfectly, just using readily available paints that most hobbyists should have without needing to resort to specialist tools like airbrushes or chipping medium. Some people have asked us for a tutorial on how she did it, so with that said, I'm going to hand over the reins to her and get this tutorial started.
So today we're going to have a look at painting terrain from the Octarius box set. I've chosen one of the scrap piles as it's an entertaining piece of terrain with a large quantity of interesting little areas that we can paint. I'm going to ultimately go for a pretty grimy, rusty look on this, and so we're going to go through how to get that effect. But the first thing that we need to do is spray the terrain piece with lead belcher, and then from there we're going to block in the various colours. The first colour that I'm going to use is Avalon Sunset as a starter, and it's going to go to most of the main flat areas that you can see. So here and the door right here. So for this I'm using a Wargamer Regiment brush, which is a fairly large brush, and I'm going to thin down the Avalon Sunset, although maybe not as thin as I would if I was going to be putting it onto miniatures and the like. And then we're just going to block in the colour fairly tidily, but we don't again have to be as concerned as if we were painting models. There we go. So I've got the Avalon Sunset layered on. I did 2 thin coats to get that effect. Now you can see possibly how some of the areas it's not quite as uniform as we would like on a normal model. That's okay, this is going to be pretty rusty. It's going to actually add to that effect of it being weathered and aged. So that's not a problem. Yellow is often a tricky colour to work with anyway, but in this instance it kind of works in our favour. So once we've blocked in that yellow, I'm going to go and move on to Corn Red from Citadel, and I'm going to mostly just use that on this rim of this broken down fan, and then we'll go on to the next block in colour. So again, you want to thin your paint down with a little bit of water. Never use it just straight out the pot. And then, as I said, I'm mostly going to focus on this rim right here. And there we go. We've got 2 thin layers of Corn Red onto that rim. I'm not going to put any more Corn Red on this particular model, but we are going to go for one last block colour. And for that I'm going to use Balthazar Gold, just to break up some of the metallics and give it a little bit more of an interesting look. Where I'm going to apply those gold colours are here on some tanks, on the little number plate here, on these canisters right here, and maybe this large cog and some of the other smaller little cogs, just to pick out some details, break up the silver a little bit. That is the Balthazar Gold. So as you can see, it's gone on pretty smoothly. We did have some areas where I had to go back over it, but a couple of thin coats will do the job usually. If you have to do a third, that's also absolutely fine. Okay, so that is all of the block colours. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to shade over the entire thing with Agrax Earthshade. Again, we're not going to worry about being perfect with it. We're just going to do the whole model. One thing to be careful with is just to make sure that all of your paints are fully dry before you start applying that shade. You don't want to be rubbing off any of the old paint. as you can see, the Agrax Earthshade has added a little bit of depth and has darkened all of the colours up, as well as sinking into the pockets to make those more defined. So it's a bit more interesting. However, we're not going to leave it there. What we're going to do actually is to pull out the deeper areas and go over those and make them even darker, so that we've got an even greater contrast between the highlights and the dark areas of the terrain. And what we're going to use to do this is game ink, black game ink from Vallejo. Now, inks are really cool because they have a lot of pigment in them, so you get a really deep colour, but because of that you need to be careful about how much you use, and you want to make sure that you're diluting the ink down to the level that you want. If you just put black ink onto this, it's almost the same as putting black paint on, so you don't want to do that. So make sure you thin it down so you're getting a nice dark but definitely translucent effect. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to literally just paint that into some of these recesses. Now that black ink has dried, you can see how it's added quite a bit of depth of contrast between the light areas and the indented areas, especially on the corrugated iron here, and also in areas like the middle section here where it's quite dark in the recesses and so on. So the next step is another inking step, and this time we're going to use the sepia game ink from Vallejo. Again, with this, pigmentation is quite strong, so you want to thin it down a little bit, because you don't want that full depth of colour. Now with this, what we're going to do is go over pretty much all of the areas that were Balthazar gold, and we're going to do that fairly universally. We're going to go over all of it because it kind of adds quite a nice colour to all of those. It makes them look a little bit more weather beaten. But we are then also going to go over the silver and add some of that, so it gives it bit of a dirty look rather than a nice clean silver, which normally we'd want, but in this particular instance we don't want that clean look. We're going for dirty, rusty, old appearance. So with this over the silver, we're going to do it in a very kind of haphazard way, just where it looks like it would look good. And you don't want it to go everywhere. You still want to see some of the silver coming through, so you definitely don't want to paint it over everything. But you don't need to be too careful about it. This is supposed to look natural and a bit messy. And this is actually a really fun stage because you aren't having to have to really be too careful about where it goes. And it's fine if some of it goes onto the yellow here, go around this area where we'd expect to see some corrosion coming through and discoloration. As I say, it doesn't have to be neat. In fact, it shouldn't be neat, and it doesn't have to be uniform. Now the sepia ink has dried, you can really see how it's pulling out the nasty little bits. It's making it look really dirty and pretty rusty already. But we're going to take this a step further, and to do this we are going to use some Typhus Corrosion Technical Paint from Citadel. In order to do this, then I really advise you use a brush that is already pretty damaged, because the Typhus Corrosion has got like little bits of sand and debris in it, which adds to the effect marvellously, but does really damage your brush. So I'm going to use an old Army Painter Regiment brush that's already in pretty bad condition. And then I'm just going to take some of the Typhus Corrosion and again start putting this on in a fairly haphazard way. Generally you want to make sure that you're covering edges of things, but again you don't want to go over this with over every single part of the model with this, but you do want a decent coverage so that you're getting the full effect, but you still want some clean silver showing through. And don't be afraid to go onto the plastic, onto the coloured areas. That's really going to pull through this impression of rustiness and corrosion. Now the Typhus Corrosion has dried, you can really see the effect that that gives in terms of both texture and colour. So it really looks corroded and rusty, which is great. But there is one last stage that we're going to do before we call it finished, and that is to take the brightest silver that we have and go over it fairly haphazardly along the edges and so on to give it that chipped look, and that will finish the effect and make it look pretty realistic. I'm going to be using chainmail silver from Vallejo, but as I say, it just needs to be any silver but the brightest silver that you've got. And again, because we are going to be doing this fairly roughly, then you want to make sure that you're using a pretty damaged brush. You don't want to be edge highlighting here, you don't want to be neat with it. It's supposed to look like chipping and weathering. Just going to really show you what I'm doing here. So I'm pretty much just dabbing pretty randomly with the flat of the paintbrush here, so you kind of get this slightly stippled effect. And there we are, that's the final result. Very rusty, chipped, nasty looking piece of terrain.
If you enjoyed what you see here, please consider giving this video a like and hit subscribe if you want to see more. You can also see more of our models at instagram.com/grimdarkgamers. That's it for this video, we'll see you all next time.